All right, everyone, buckle up, because today we're diving deep into something pretty major for UK workers, the new Employment Rights Bill.
Yeah, it's been everywhere, right?
Everywhere you look, government's talking about it, it's all over the news.
Headlines, yeah.
We even found some business leaders chiming in, and let me tell you, they don't all agree on this one.
Not at all. It's a mixed bag for sure.
So we're here to break it all down, figure out what's really going on, and most importantly, what it means for you. Is this thing the real deal, or is it just a bunch of hype?
Well, and how is it all going to play out in the real world? That's the big question.
Exactly.
Because this bill is not just some minor tweaks here and there.
No kidding.
It's touching practically every part of work life, from your first day on the job
Important.
to what happens if you get sick, how families are supported, even tackling things like the gender pay gap. It's massive. The goal seems to be to make work fairer and more modern, which, on the face of it,
Sounds great.
sounds good, right? But the devil is always in the details.
Always. So let's get into it, shall we? One of the first things that jumped out at me was this whole day one rights thing. Sounds very official.
Very official.
But what does it actually mean?
Well, it boils down to this. No more waiting 2 years to be protected from unfair dismissal. You're covered from day one.
Which is huge. I mean,
Right.
that's got to be a weight off so many people's shoulders. Starting a new job can be stressful enough as it is, right?
Absolutely.
Ah.
But here's where it gets a bit more, shall we say, nuanced.
Oh.
The government's also planning to consult on a new probationary period.
Okay, so like a trial run for both sides.
Exactly. And they're talking about making it around 9 months long.
Mm-hmm.
So workers get that initial protection, but employers also get a decent amount of time to make sure it's the right fit.
Makes sense.
Yeah.
It's all about finding that balance, isn't it?
Exactly. And that balance is crucial because it could actually be a win-win. Employers might be more likely to take a chance on someone new, knowing they have that probation period. And employees, they might be more willing to try something different, even switch careers entirely if they're not locked into a job for 2 years.
It's like taking the pressure off a bit for everyone involved. Okay, so that's day one rights. Now let's talk about something else that caught my eye. 0-hour contracts. We've all heard the stories, right?
Yeah.
The uncertainty, the lack of guaranteed hours.
Not knowing how much you'll be earning week to week.
It's tough.
It can be incredibly stressful. And this bill, it's taking aim at what they're calling exploitative 0-hour contracts.
Okay, so they're not getting rid of them completely.
That's the thing. They're trying to weed out the bad apples. But the big question is, how? How do they define exploitative? That's where it gets really interesting and potentially very tricky.
Because a vague term like that, it leaves a lot of wiggle room, right?
A lot of wiggle room. We'll have to wait and see what the fine print says.
Exactly. But it does sound like they're trying to address some of the worst abuses, which is a start.
It's a start, hopefully a step in the right direction.
Fingers crossed. Okay, moving on to something that just feels wrong on so many levels. Fire and rehire.
Ugh, yeah.
I mean, imagine this. You're doing your job, everything's going fine, and then bam, you're fired.
Out of the blue.
Only to be offered your job back, but with worse pay, worse hours, worse conditions. It's just
Demoralizing.
completely.
It's been a point of contention for a long time, and rightfully so.
Absolutely. So what's the bill saying about it?
Well, the aim is to close the loopholes that have allowed this practice to continue, to finally put a stop to it.
Because it just feels so unfair, doesn't it?
It is. It's exploiting a power imbalance. And this bill, at least on paper, is trying to level the playing field a bit.
Well, let's hope it works. Now, what about sick pay? The current system. Let's just say it's not exactly something to write home about, is it?
No, it definitely needs some work. That waiting period, the earnings threshold,
Yeah.
it's not the safety net it should be.
Especially for people in physically demanding jobs who might need to take time off more often.
Absolutely, they're hit the hardest.
So how does this bill propose to fix it?
Well, it's tackling those two big issues head on. No more waiting period.
Okay, so you qualify for sick pay from day one.
Day one, no matter your salary. They're getting rid of that lower earnings limit, too. It's a major improvement.
That's huge. And about time, if you ask me. Okay, this next one feels very future of work, wouldn't you say? We're talking flexible working.
The dream.
The dream, right. And the bill basically says that flexible working should be the default where practical.
Where practical, which of course begs the question.
What does where practical actually mean in the real world?
Right. It's one of those phrases that sounds great in theory, but the devil, as always, is in the details.
Because what works for a tech worker coding from home might not work for a nurse on a hospital ward, right?
Exactly. It's not one size fits all. We're going to need a lot more clarity on how this is going to be interpreted and implemented across different sectors.
Because otherwise it just becomes a recipe for confusion and inconsistency, and potentially even more headaches down the line.
Exactly.
Speaking of big changes, this bill also delves into some pretty weighty topics. The gender pay gap and menopause support. It feels like we're finally starting to have these conversations at a policy level, which feels long overdue.
Absolutely. It's about time these issues are taken seriously. Now, it's important to note that this part of the bill is aimed specifically at larger employers. They're the ones who will need to create action plans
Action plans for what, specifically?
for tackling those pay gaps, of course.
Mhm.
But also, and this is significant, for supporting employees going through menopause.
Mhm.
It's acknowledging that this is a workplace issue, not just a women's issue.
Which is a big step forward in terms of changing attitudes and creating more supportive workplaces. Okay, let's talk about another group that deserves all the support they can get: new parents and pregnant workers. Because losing your job when you're expecting or on leave just adds another layer of stress that nobody needs.
It's the last thing you need during what should be such a special time.
Absolutely. So what kind of safeguards does the bill put in place for them?
Well, it basically strengthens the protections that are already there. So it'll be much harder to let someone go during pregnancy, while they're on maternity leave, and even when they come back to work.
It's about providing that job security, that peace of mind during such a huge life change.
Exactly.
Okay, last but not least, let's talk about this new agency the bill proposes creating, the Fair Work Agency. What's the deal with that?
Basically, they're taking all the existing enforcement bodies, the ones that make sure all these rules are actually being followed.
Right, because a law is only as good as its enforcement.
Exactly. So they're bringing them all together under one roof.
Streamlining things, hopefully.
That's the idea. Make it all a bit less messy. And importantly, this Fair Work Agency, they're going to be the ones making sure all these new rights, things like holiday pay, are actually happening, that employers are actually playing by the rules. But it's not just about enforcement. They're also going to be giving employers like a roadmap, clear guidance on how to actually follow all these new rules.
Which has got to be helpful, especially for smaller businesses.
Oh, absolutely.
They don't all have big HR departments to figure this stuff out, right?
Exactly. It's a lot to keep up with.
Imagine trying to run your business, and on top of that, you've got to decode all this legal jargon. It can be overwhelming.
Totally. So the hope is that the Fair Work Agency can make it easier, less daunting for businesses to do the right thing, but also, make it a lot harder for those who try to get away with cutting corners.
Right, so it's about making it clear what's expected and holding everyone accountable, leveling the playing field. Okay, so we've talked about a lot of the nitty-gritty, the potential good, the potential bad. But let's bring it back to you for a second, the listener. What does all this actually mean for you day to day? Because that's what we're really here to figure out, right?
100%. And I think this is where it's helpful to kind of zoom out a little bit. Look at the bigger picture. Because this bill, it's not just about specific rights, although those are obviously hugely important.
Right.
It's about changing the whole dynamic between employers and employees, setting a new standard for what's considered okay in the workplace.
So like raising the bar for everyone.
Exactly. And those ripples, they go way beyond these specific changes. Like, imagine you're looking for a new job. Knowing
Yeah.
you'll have these rights from the start, that could completely change how you approach your search,
I
right?
feel like take more chances.
Exactly. Maybe you apply for a job in a company or a sector that you might have been a bit hesitant about before.
Right. It's like it takes away some of the risks.
So that leap of faith, yeah.
Yeah, especially when you're just starting out, still figuring things out.
Absolutely. And for
Right.
those who are already, settled in their jobs.
They might start asking for more.
Exactly. It might get them thinking, hold on, is my workplace keeping up with these new standards? Am I getting a fair deal? And if the answer is no, well, maybe it's time for a conversation or even, a change of scenery.
Right, because sometimes you don't realize what you're missing out on until you see how other people are doing things. And this bill, it could be a real wake-up call for a lot of employers.
100%. A catalyst for some much needed change. And think about the long-term effects, on things like work-life balance, gender equality, even mental health in the workplace. I mean, if this bill does what it sets out to do, we could be looking at a future where work is healthier, more supportive, more fulfilling for everybody.
Happier employees are more productive employees. It's common sense, really.
It really is. It's in everyone's best interest to create a work environment where people feel valued, respected, and supported.
Couldn't agree more. Now, it's important to remember, isn't it, that Rome wasn't built in a day. And these
Oh,
changes,
yeah, this is a
they're
process.
not going to happen overnight.
Right, we're talking consultations, implementation phases. This is going to take time to fully roll out.
So don't go into work tomorrow expecting everything to be magically different.
Exactly. Manage those expectations because this bill, it's a starting point. It's a statement of intent. Now the real work begins, turning those good intentions into actual changes that people can see and feel where it matters in their workplaces.
And that's what we're all about, right? Helping people make sense of it all, cutting through the noise, and empowering them to make their voices heard.
100%. It's about staying informed, engaged, and speaking up.
Because the future of work in the UK, it's being shaped right now. And everyone deserves to have a say in that.
Couldn't agree more. This isn't about telling people how things should be. It's about having a conversation, working together to find solutions that benefit everybody.
Speaking of finding solutions, I'm curious to dig a bit deeper into some of the finer points of this bill. Like, when we say exploitative 0 hours contract, what does that actually mean in practice? And what does flexible working as the default really look like in different industries for people with different lives, different needs? There's a lot to unpack there. It's a bit of a tightrope walk, isn't it? Trying to make things fairer, but also
Without taking away options that work for some people.
exactly. Like with these 0 hour contracts, I can see both sides. On the one hand, you've got people stuck in these situations, never knowing how much they'll earn from one week to the next. It's not right.
Definitely not. That kind of uncertainty can be really tough to build a life around.
Exactly. But then on the other hand, I don't know, let's say you're a student or you're juggling childcare and you need that flexibility of being able to pick and choose your hours. 0 hours can work for that.
They can, yeah. If it's a genuine choice, not something that's being forced on someone because they have no other options.
Right, because that's not real flexibility, is it?
Not at all. It's about having control over your own work life, having options.
Yeah.
And that's why this exploitative definition is going to be so crucial. They've really got to get that right.
Because if they're too broad, you risk taking away a work model that actually suits some people, right? And that helps businesses too, to be able to call on people when they need them.
Exactly. It's about finding that sweet spot,
Mhm.
where workers are protected, but we're also not stifling genuine flexibility. It's a delicate balance.
For sure. And speaking of delicate balances, flexible working as the default again sounds great in principle, but how do you make that work in every industry? I mean, you can't exactly run a restaurant remotely, can you?
You can't operate on someone from your kitchen table.
Exactly. So where does that leave us?
Well, I think it comes back to that where practical bit. And honestly, I think it'll come down to individual employers having those open conversations with their staff, really understanding their needs, their circumstances, and then being willing to be flexible within the context of their industry. Maybe for some, it's compressed hours. For others, it's job sharing. The key is moving away from that rigid 9 to 5 mindset and finding what works.
So it's less about dictating what flexibility should look like.
And more about creating a culture where it's encouraged,
Exactly.
where employers are open to having those conversations and employees feel empowered to ask for what they need.
It's a culture shift.
Huge culture shift.
Yeah.
And those don't happen overnight, right? It's going to take time and effort and a whole lot of open communication on both sides.
Well, on that note, I think it's time for us to wrap things up.
Time flies when you're talking about the future of work.
It really does. But seriously, we've covered a lot today. Day one rights, 0 hour contracts, flexible working, the gender pay gap. This bill is trying to tackle some pretty big issues.
It is. And whether it succeeds or not, whether it goes far enough, that remains to be seen.
Exactly. But what we do know is this is just the beginning of the conversation.
Just the tip of the iceberg.
As these changes are debated, refined, hopefully improved, it's going to be more important than ever to stay informed and engaged.
Stay curious. Keep asking questions.
Because the future of work, it's not something that just happens to us. It's something we shape together.
And that's it for this deep dive. From both of us, thanks for listening. We'll see you next time.